There are moments in life that knock the air out of your chest, not because they're loud, but because they're painfully quiet. And sometimes, all it takes is 3 seconds, 3 seconds for someone to look at you, decide who you are, and walk away like your story means nothing. It's brutal. It's humiliating. And the worst part isn't the rejection itself, it's the feeling that your entire worth was weighed and dismissed before you even had the chance to say hello. But here's the paradox nobody talks about: it's not your pain that scares people, it's their inability to handle what they don't understand. And that's exactly what happened to her that night. A date she hoped would be simple, light, normal, shattered the moment he saw her wheelchair. He didn't ask a question. He didn't sit down. He just turned around and left. Yet life has this strange, almost mischievous way of revealing who actually deserves a place in your story. Because while she sat there fighting the familiar sting of abandonment, something absolutely unexpected happened. A gesture so human, so quiet, so powerful, that it changed everything about that night. And if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been judged before you got the chance to show who you truly are, then you're going to feel this story all the way to your bones. There were days when she woke up with that bitter feeling that no matter how hard she tried, she would never be enough for anyone. It felt like she carried an invisible label pinned to her chest, one that silently screamed, fragile. Complicated. Too much. The cruel part was that she never created that label, other people did, people who left behind scars disguised as advice. And the man who walked out the moment he saw her wheelchair didn't know it, but he added another crack to a structure she held upright with sheer stubbornness. It's strange how humans get used to carrying weights that don't belong to them, as if walking bent over was the only possible way to live. Still, she smiled at the mirror every morning, pretending everything was fine. Pretending it didn't hurt. Pretending she wasn't exhausted. The fear of not being valued grew quietly, like a weed invading a garden, slowly, steadily, without asking permission. Sometimes all it took was a careless comment, a sideways glance, a rushed judgment to awaken every insecurity she tried to bury. It was like hearing the same cruel whisper over and over again: you will never be chosen. And when that whisper is repeated by the wrong people, it becomes belief. That's why she avoided dates, avoided opening up, avoided expectations. People who suffer too much learn to anticipate the fall before even climbing a single step. It was instinct, a natural defense, protecting her heart before someone crushed it again. Yet she still longed to be truly seen, even if she never admitted it. Deep down, everyone longs for that. She remembered something a therapist once told her, in a voice so calm it seemed capable of reorganizing the world: people who fear not being valued often give their hearts in halves. And the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She never shared her whole story. Never revealed her full pain. Never showed her true strength. Hiding parts of herself felt safer, like closing windows before a storm. But living like that was the emotional equivalent of breathing through a straw, surviving, not living. Sometimes she wondered what it would be like to open every door, to let someone in, to allow herself to be seen as she truly was. And strangely enough, it was in that very doubt that the waiter entered her story. The fear of not being valued made her mind play cruel tricks. If someone looked away for a second, she assumed she'd done something wrong. If a conversation paused, she believed she'd annoyed them. If someone stepped back, she was certain she wasn't good enough. These thoughts were preloaded responses her heart had learned long ago, automatic defenses that arrived before the moment even happened. But in that restaurant, for the first time in years, someone looked past those reflexes. The waiter didn't see the chair, or the half-told story, or the disappointment trembling in her hands. He saw a person. He saw hurt. He saw dignity struggling to stand. And maybe that's why he chose to act in a way that would change the direction of her night entirely. It's strange how life sometimes sends strangers to stand where familiar people once failed. Maybe it's the universe's quiet way of saying, don't give up, good still exists. And she felt that, in the exact moment when all she wanted was to disappear. She was seconds away from leaving, seconds away from reinforcing the old story she carried, that she would never be enough, when she heard the waiter gently say her name, not with pity, but with respect. It was like he held a small lantern and shined it into a dark corner of her soul, a corner she avoided at all costs. And right there, in that simple moment, something began to shift, something she didn't yet understand, but that would lead her straight into her deepest wound, the pain of past relationships. The pain from her past relationships always showed up when she least expected it, like uninvited guests who already knew the way in and didn't bother knocking. It wasn't just the memory of what happened, it was the memory of everything that never happened, the broken promises, the conversations that ended halfway, all the "this will work out" moments that never did. Sometimes it took only a song playing in the background to remind her of someone who claimed to love her but only loved the idea of having someone. Other times, hearing "you deserve better" felt like a polite way of saying, you were never enough. The people she once loved had left marks that were anything but gentle. They weren't scars, they were open cuts that still burned whenever life triggered old wounds. She tried to pretend she didn't carry all of that with her, but the body remembers even when the mind begs to forget. When you've been pushed off an emotional cliff before, you learn to fear the wind. That's why, when the man from her date walked out the moment he saw the wheelchair, she didn't think, he's cruel. She thought, of course, again. That, again, was heavy, full of stories she never told anyone, ignored messages, cancelled plans, people who treated her like a problem instead of a possibility. Over time, she learned to smile like nothing hurt, but inside she was full of tiny shards of disappointment lodged deep within. Every emotional step she took had to be carefully calculated so she wouldn't cut herself open again. The truth was she had loved people who only saw their own pain. She loved those who used her as an emotional bridge, those who only came around when they needed something, and those who vanished the moment she needed them. She had loved people who praised her strength but ran from her vulnerability. It's easy to romanticize resilience, but few understand the cost of building that armor. She remembered someone once telling her, "You're too much for me." At the time, it pierced her. Now, she realized it had been true, but not for the reason he believed. She was too much for someone who didn't know how to love. Too much for someone who only wanted half of her. Those memories, though old, echoed loudly whenever life disappointed her again, like now. She carried a huge fear of being compared all the time, as if someone somewhere had an invisible ruler measuring every flaw she had. Her past taught her to expect very little from others but too much from herself, sometimes too much. That's why, when the waiter approached her that night, she expected another cliché line, another pity-filled gesture, another uncomfortable attempt at kindness. The past conditions you that way, like someone who's been startled too many times and now jumps at every soft noise. That's exactly how she felt inside, always bracing herself, shrinking, trying not to take up emotional space. Until that moment when she realized perhaps she wasn't the one who was small, maybe everyone else had always been. But the waiter didn't lower his voice, didn't speak slowly, didn't treat her like someone fragile. He didn't bring her past to the table the way so many others had. Instead, he brought something she barely recognized anymore, consideration. He sat beside her for a moment, not across from her, like someone unafraid to share the same space. And he said something simple, but with a sincerity so steady it nearly dissolved every defense she had built over the years. Suddenly, all her old wounds pulsed, not because they hurt, but because his unexpected kindness nudged a truth she'd long avoided, for as painful as her past relationships were, an even heavier pain was waiting just underneath, the pain of carrying everything alone. The pain of carrying everything alone was an old burden, one of those weights that start small, almost unnoticeable, but grow heavier with time until they become a kind of exhaustion that doesn't show in the eyes, only in the soul. She had always handled things by herself, not out of strength, but out of lack of choice. When you grow up surrounded by people who promise to help but never show up when you really need them, you learn early that the only person you can rely on is yourself. The saddest part is how that becomes such a deep habit that even when someone does offer help, you don't know how to accept it anymore. That was her, independence as a shield, a defense, a wall. But inside her, there was a silent scream begging for rest, the kind of rest that only comes when someone says, "It's okay, I'll take care of this today." She knew what it was like to carry heavy groceries alone, push heavy doors alone, navigate lines, doctors, bills, repairs, problems, everything alone. But there was a weight even heavier, carrying her emotional pain without sharing it with anyone. There's a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being physically alone, but being emotionally exhausted. She remembered crying quietly in the bathroom so no one would worry, and feeling that familiar sting of, no one will ever really be there for me. Maybe that's why the rejection at the restaurant hurt so much. It wasn't just about a man walking away. It was the cruel confirmation that once again, she would have to swallow the entire experience alone. Once again, life was piling weight onto her shoulders. And yet, there was incredible strength in the way she handled the world. A strength no one noticed, because for most people, strength is loud, and hers was silent. The strength to wake up without motivation, to smile without desire, to keep going without direction. The strength to not give up on herself even when everyone else seemed to give up first. The truth is that people who carry everything alone develop rare abilities, resilience, adaptability, humor enough to survive the chaos. And even though she played that role well, there were days when she deeply wished someone would say, "You don't have to be strong today." Without knowing it, the waiter touched exactly this place inside her when he approached. When he noticed she was about to leave, he didn't do what everyone else usually did, ignore, pretend not to see, or smile out of awkward politeness. He approached calmly, with a look that said, "I really noticed you." He asked whether she wanted some water, if she needed help adjusting the chair, but he asked in such a natural way that it didn't feel like pity, it felt like care. There is a huge difference between helping out of obligation and helping because you recognize the humanity in someone. She felt that immediately. He wasn't trying to take over her life, he was simply showing her that she didn't have to carry everything without support. It was a small gesture, but it hit the exact spot where her soul was most tired, the weight of a daily life no one else saw. And in that moment, as he waited respectfully for her answer, without rushing her, without pressuring her, she realized something inside her was being called to the surface. It felt like someone had turned on a small light in a hallway she had kept shut for years. A soft light, not enough to reveal everything, but enough to show something important. Maybe she wasn't meant to carry everything forever. Maybe someone could share a piece of that weight one day. But as this realization surfaced, another, older feeling rose with it, the kind of pain that stays even when you're not alone. The pain of loneliness, a loneliness that isn't cured by physical company, but by genuine presence. Her loneliness wasn't made only of empty days, it was made of silences collected over the years. It was the kind of loneliness that hurt even when people were around, because what she lacked wasn't physical presence but emotional presence. She had sat at crowded tables feeling completely invisible, had been ignored in the middle of important conversations, had watched people glance past her as if she made no difference at all. And maybe that's the cruelest part of loneliness, when it finds you even in the places where you were supposed to feel welcomed. That night at the restaurant, when her date left without even looking back, her loneliness gained a face, the face of indifference. And indifference is always the sharpest blow, because it doesn't scream, but it destroys. There are many ways to be alone, and she knew every one of them. The loneliness of absence, when no one checks if you got home safely. The loneliness of rejection, when someone decides you're not worth staying for. The loneliness of routine, when you wake up every day to the same responsibilities but with no one to share the weight. And the loneliness of invisibility, the most painful one, when no one truly sees you. She filled that emptiness with work, music, old TV shows, messages she never sent because she feared being a burden. She mastered saying, "I'm fine," as if it were a warning sign on a door, "Don't come in, there's a mess here." But in truth, she just wanted someone to say, "I can come in anyway." It's strange how the world often hits the hardest those who are already wounded. When you live alone for too long, you create emotional survival methods that look like strength but are actually camouflage. She pretended she didn't need anyone, but deep down she longed for someone to tell about a bad day, a silly joke, a dream she had last night. She didn't need a romance, just someone to share the small things with. Loneliness does that, it turns simple details into emotional luxuries. And when a lonely person encounters the smallest gesture of genuine kindness, it hits deep. That's why the waiter's attentive, human gaze moved her so much, because for a moment, it broke the bubble of invisibility. While she tried to hide her embarrassment, the waiter realized this wasn't an ordinary situation. His eyes, trained after years of observing people, caught details most would overlook: the way she pressed her fingers against her lap, the way her posture was too rigid, the way she avoided looking around as if afraid of finding pity in someone's expression. He understood that loneliness wasn't about being physically alone, it was about feeling unaccompanied even when the whole world was present. And he did something almost no one does anymore: he approached without intruding, offered help without overpowering her, created a safe space without asking anything in return. A simple attitude, but one that struck right where her loneliness hurt the most, in the feeling of belonging nowhere. That feeling, that small moment of care, was the first crack in a wall she'd built over many years. It wasn't that the loneliness disappeared, deep wounds don't vanish in minutes. But something inside her began shifting. As if that simple gesture had opened a door she kept locked ever since she learned, through the harshest ways, that trusting always comes with risks. And that was exactly the point where another pain waited for her, a pain she knew too well, a pain that had repeated itself so many times she could almost predict it, the pain of being tested, used, or measured against expectations she never agreed to carry. The pain of realizing not everyone approaches to add, some approach to prove something to themselves. The pain of being tested or used isn't born from big betrayals, it's born from small disloyalties repeated over time. She had been treated as an experience, a curiosity, a "let's see if I can handle this," never as a priority. It was as if some men saw her not as a person, but as an ego test, like saying, "Let me see if I'm capable of dealing with this." And this meant her. There was no love in that, no respect, only an emotional experiment to measure limits that weren't even theirs. Every time someone did that, they left behind the bitter feeling of being used to fill someone else's emptiness but never her own heart. And that hurt far more than she ever admitted aloud. What hurt even more was realizing that many people approached her only to feel better about themselves. It was cruel, but true. People who wanted to look open-minded, people who said, "I accept you as you are," as if it were a favor, people who used her to appear virtuous online but vanished as soon as the emotional spotlight turned off. She hated being treated like a moral trophy. Being used so someone could say, "Look how evolved I am." It wasn't affection, it was vanity. And deep down, those interactions left scars because they reinforced a fear she carried like a shadow, that no one would ever approach her for who she truly was, only for what she represented. That date was just another painful example of it. He saw her, the chair, the imagined difficulty, and he ran. He didn't leave because of her personality, he left because he saw a test he didn't want to take, a mirror he didn't want to face. And the saddest part? She wasn't asking for bravery or sacrifice. She just wanted a normal date. But to many people, she was always a checkpoint of their own emotional maturity. And that hurt deeply. It hurts to be treated like someone's emotional resume instead of a whole human being. It hurts to feel like you're a challenge to be solved rather than a person to be known. This was a pain nearly impossible to explain, but the waiter understood instantly, in a way that felt almost uncanny. Because when he knelt beside her to speak at her level, he didn't look like a man testing empathy or trying to appear kind. His gestures weren't performative, they were natural. He said things like, "You didn't deserve that. Can I bring you the menu? Or would you prefer I just sit here with you for a minute?" And in that moment, she realized something powerful. His kindness wasn't rooted in pity or in a need to look like a hero. It came from someone who didn't need to use her to prove anything about himself. He wasn't trying to validate his own goodness, he was recognizing hers. That difference, simple yet rare, shook her heart awake in places she believed had gone numb. And that feeling, the relief of not being analyzed, measured, or tested, opened room for something new inside her. A timid, fragile courage to believe that perhaps, just maybe, there were still people capable of seeing beyond surfaces. The waiter didn't just shield her from another emotional wound, he briefly lifted the heavy sense of being used as someone else's moral measuring stick. Yet this small moment of relief awakened something even deeper, an urgent need she had carried for years, the need to be seen as a whole person, not as scattered pieces of someone else's expectations. And that quiet but powerful desire became the bridge to her next inner battle. Being seen as a whole person had always been her greatest wish, and ironically, her greatest challenge. Not because she wasn't complete, but because most people only saw pieces of her, the wheelchair, the tough past, the assumed limitations, the pain they imagined she carried. It was as if people placed emotional filters over her, each one stealing a different part of her humanity. Some saw fragility, others saw inspiration, but very few ever saw the real woman behind all that. And that was the most painful part, knowing that to most people, she didn't have layers, humor, dreams, or depth. She was always reduced to a single word. A single label. A single assumption. And living like that was suffocating. She wanted to be seen as the person who laughed too loudly at silly movies, who loved strong coffee, who collected bookmarks, who feared thunderstorms, and who cried at small acts of kindness. She wanted someone to notice she listened to old music, cooked well, struggled with math but was great with people. She wanted someone to understand that her wheelchair wasn't her definition, it was simply her way of moving through the world. Everyone has something. One wears glasses, another uses a cane, another carries invisible scars, another hides emotional bruises. But for some reason, in her case, that something made people believe they could understand all of her without ever trying. And that was deeply unfair. Inside that restaurant, however, something unexpected happened. In just minutes, the waiter saw more of her than many people had seen in years. He didn't treat her like a tragic story or someone who needed saving. And maybe that's what makes certain encounters so transformative. Sometimes someone with genuine empathy sees what the world stubbornly ignores, that the person in front of them is full of layers, nuance, humor, strength, vulnerability, and light. He didn't try to guess who she was, he asked. He didn't assume her limits, he gave her choices. He didn't look at her chair, he looked into her eyes. And that changed everything. Because being seen as a whole person doesn't take much, it takes presence, attention, and humanity. And he carried all three effortlessly. A posture, a look, a simple, "Is it okay if I sit here with you for a moment?" A gentle, "Do you prefer tea or water?" Simple questions, but deeply meaningful when life has numbed you with indifference. He showed her that being truly seen isn't about dramatizing someone's pain, but recognizing their full existence. And maybe that's why she felt her chest tighten when she realized she wasn't being treated as an exception, but as an equal. That equality, so rare in her world, stirred emotions she had tried to lock away. As he spoke to her naturally, she realized she was breathing differently for the first time in years, lighter, freer, more herself. It felt as if he had quietly given back permission for her to exist without having to justify every piece of who she was. And even though she tried to steady her heart, something inside her whispered that this moment wouldn't end here. He had seen her as a whole person, and once someone truly sees you, it becomes impossible to return to who you were before. But just as she began embracing this new feeling, another powerful emotion surfaced inside her, the hunger for emotional justice, the deep human need to finally receive what life had taken for so long. Emotional justice isn't revenge. It's not loud, it's not immediate, and it doesn't come from anger. Emotional justice is subtle but powerful. It's the moment life returns to you what your heart truly deserved all along. She didn't wish anything bad on the man who walked away. Truth is, she was too tired to hold on to anger anymore. But deep inside, there was a quiet voice, an old one, that whispered that someday life would reveal who people really were. Not out of spite, but out of balance. And there, in that restaurant, feeling the unexpected gentleness of the waiter, she sensed that maybe, just maybe, emotional justice was finally beginning to unfold. Because emotional justice isn't about punishing someone, it's about repairing you. It's life returning to your heart what it lost after being strong for far too long. It's found in small acts of restoration, someone who looks you in the eyes when so many looked away, someone who listens when others ignored your voice, someone who treats you as equal when others placed you above or below for all the wrong reasons. And that's exactly what she felt when the waiter approached with calm, steady care, as if he were silently saying, "The mistake is not in you. The mistake is in who failed to see you." She had always believed that life had its own quiet way of balancing things out. Sometimes, after a long storm, emotional justice arrives in the shape of unexpected shelter. Sometimes it comes as a light conversation after a heavy day. Sometimes it shows up in someone who simply gives back the feeling that you deserve something good. The waiter could have offered just water, just the menu, just the basics, but he offered presence. And presence is the greatest form of justice someone can receive after years of being the one left behind. He didn't apologize for the man who walked away, but without knowing, he softened the wound the other man had caused. Emotional justice also means recognizing within yourself that things could, and should, be different. It's the awakening of a quiet truth that says, "I deserve better than this." Because when someone uses you, tests you, or abandons you, the pain isn't just in the act, it's in the conclusion your heart draws from it. But at that moment, with the waiter sitting beside her, she realized something important. Her story didn't have to follow the same script. What happened to her that night wasn't a verdict on her worth, it was simply a reflection of the character of the man who left. An understanding that felt like breathing fresh air after drowning for far too long. And the most surprising thing about emotional justice is that it rarely arrives with noise. It comes in details, in the right people, in gestures that seem small but repair something huge inside you. And at that table, between a comfortable silence and a gentle gaze, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope reconnecting pieces of her she thought were permanently broken. But that hope didn't show up in a dramatic way. It arrived as a quiet promise that maybe life was preparing something bigger for her. And that small seed of hope became the bridge to the final step she didn't know she was ready for, rebuilding her ability to believe again. Hope doesn't return all at once, it comes back in small pieces, almost as if it's afraid of taking up space. And that was exactly how she felt the first spark inside her, a small fragment, timid, barely noticeable, but real. After so many falls, so many disappointments, and so many silent battles, she had convinced herself that hope was something reserved for other people. People with easier lives, lighter stories, smoother paths. But inside that restaurant, with the waiter sitting near her, offering humanity where others had offered cruelty, she realized something quietly transformative. Maybe hope had never truly left. Maybe it was just waiting for the right moment to return. Rebuilding hope doesn't mean ignoring the pain. In truth, it means facing it without fear. It means recognizing that the world can wound you, yes, but it can also surprise you with sudden healing. She realized life had this strange way of offering light right after the darkest nights. And slowly, the man who walked away became irrelevant. He was no longer the center of her story, just a footnote in a much larger narrative unfolding before her. And the waiter, with his simple gestures and sincere eyes, became living proof that there were still people capable of seeing past surfaces. Hope also rebuilds itself through small choices, the little steps she allowed herself to take. A timid smile toward the waiter. A genuine "thank you." A heart that, for the first time in years, dared to believe that the world might still hold kindness big enough to welcome her vulnerabilities. She couldn't control other people's actions, but she could choose the meaning she gave to what happened. And that was a kind of strength life had never taken from her. When she lifted her head and met the waiter's eyes, she realized she wasn't just experiencing a nice moment, she was witnessing something inside her coming back to life. Hope also rebuilds itself when someone shows you that you don't have to be strong all the time. And he did that effortlessly. He didn't try to fix her, change her story, or minimize her pain. He simply stayed. And true presence, quiet, steady, sincere, has the power to heal wounds we didn't even remember were still open. She realized maybe the problem had never been her. Maybe it had always been the world around her, a world that valued the shallow over the deep, the fast over the real. And strangely, that realization brought her peace. And as she allowed herself to breathe a little deeper, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a genuine desire to believe that good things could still happen. Not because someone promised it, but because something inside her was finally ready to bloom again. Hope, even after years of silence, began pulsing in her chest, a mature hope, not a naive one. A hope that understood pain but chose, still, to continue. And it was exactly that courageous choice that opened the door to the next chapter, the moment she would finally understand that what happened that night wasn't a coincidence, it was a beginning. In the end, the most powerful part of her story wasn't the man who walked away, it was everything that grew after he left. Sometimes life removes people who were never meant to stay, just so there's space for those who see us fully, without fear, without hesitation, without judgment. And if you're still here, watching this until the very last moment, maybe you felt that same sting before, that mix of shame and strength, heartbreak and courage, loneliness and rebirth. You know exactly how it feels to hold yourself together while everything inside you threatens to fall apart. But you also know the miracle that happens when one act of kindness brings you back to life. So let me ask you, just you, from me. How many times have you accepted emotional crumbs because you thought that was all you deserved? How many times have you silenced your pain just to avoid sounding dramatic? How many times have you stopped trying because you were terrified of living the same hurt again? The truth is simple, even if it hurts, you are not meant to be remembered only for the pain you carried, but for the quiet strength with which you kept going, even when nobody noticed. And maybe this is your moment to ask yourself, what is life trying to show me right now? What am I still accepting that keeps hurting me? What story do I want to write from this moment on? Because behind every scar, there is always a choice: keep living in fear of rejection, or allow hope to walk back into your life, even gently, even slowly. So today, choose yourself. Just for today. Do one small thing that reminds you that you are still here. You still matter. You still deserve what is real. And before you go, I want to ask you something important. If this story touched you, if it reminded you of a moment you lived, or if it helped you see yourself with more compassion, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications. Here, every week, you'll find stories that lift you up, hold you, and remind you that you are not alone. And tell me in the comments, which moment of this story hit you the hardest, and why? I read every single one.